sustain the glory of life within my being. I will win my ascension, I will sing all eyes of heaven will sing, the idol of my outer self. I will have the glory on my immaculate divinely conceived self, manifesting within me. I am freedom and I am determined to be freedom. I am the flame of freedom and I am determined to bear it to all. I am God's freedom and He is indeed free. I am freed by His power and His power is supreme. I am fulfilling the purposes of God's kingdom.
We're here today to talk about AIDS, a virus which actually threatens the existence of mankind. There are many people that believe that this virus is a natural phenomenon, but it's my conclusion after several years of study that the AIDS virus is actually a man-made phenomenon. It's not only man-made, it was predicted as far back as 1970 or 71 or 2 by J. Clemenson, who was a world-renowned epidemiologist. It was in a sense requested in 1972 by what I think is a written paper which lies in the medical literature in the Bulletin of the World Health Organization. In 1972, the World Health Organization said, let's make a virus that selectively destroys the T-cell systems of man. The virus was then manufactured, in my opinion, by crossing two known retroviruses, one of cattle and one of sheep. The one of cattle is named bovine leukemia virus, the one of sheep is named Visna virus. It was then perhaps detested either accidentally or on purpose, and we now have a man-made species-threatening virus, AIDS. That's what we're here to discuss today.
You're being sold a global epidemic, it's called AIDS, and by and large you believe it. My contention is, after spending a year or so writing a book on the subject, that AIDS is a synonym basically for immune suppression, and immune suppression has hundreds of causes: viral, microbes, chemicals, pesticides, all sorts of things. And that the reason for selling a global epidemic is to, one, make pharmaceutical profits, billions of dollars of pharmaceutical profits. And another reason for selling a global epidemic is to force governments and societies to polarize, to bring about detention, quarantine, to take those people off the scene who are politically unsound according to their governments, who say things their governments don't appreciate, and that in general a picture is being painted of a unified epidemic that does not really exist.
There are many myths and misperceptions about AIDS. Some of these myths and misperceptions have been supplied by the government, given to the media, and accepted as facts. From the very beginning of this epidemic, people were told that it was a gay disease, and people believed it. Now, of course, we know that it is not a gay disease, and that there is really no such thing as gay cancer. I think if you study some of the facts that hopefully will come out in this meeting, that you will come to the conclusion that the origin of AIDS most probably lies in a biological warfare attack which is really unprecedented on our planet, and as such, I think that we do not really realize to this day what has happened. I hope that this seminar will open up some thought and dialogue as to this dastardly possibility, which I admit is terribly depressing, that AIDS may be the result of biological warfare.
Historically, Americans have been called to be the keepers of the flame of liberty, and that liberty depends on innovative thinkers, the free exchange of ideas, and people with a can-do spirit.
The flame of freedom speaks, the flame of freedom within each
Elizabeth Clare Prophet, noted author, lecturer, educator, and religious leader, interviews revolutionaries in every field who provide the missing dimension to the news that affects you. The forum you are about to see was filmed before thousands assembled at the Royal Teton Ranch in Park County, Montana. Here, in a secluded valley in the heart of the Northern Rockies, concerned citizens of the world gather each summer to attend an international conference for spiritual freedom. They commune with life, meet old friends and new, and hear the flame of freedom that speaks through Elizabeth Clare Prophet and her guests at Summit University Forum. Listen as Elizabeth Clare Prophet and her guests discuss the critical issues of the day.
Welcome to Summit University Forum, where the flame of freedom speaks. I'm Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Leading scientists say AIDS is caused by a naturally occurring virus called human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. But not everyone agrees. Some believe that AIDS is caused by HIV, but that it is a man-made virus which escaped from the laboratory, or was deliberately introduced into the population as a sinister act of biological warfare. Others believe that HIV has never been shown to cause AIDS, but that the scientific establishment and pharmaceutical industry perpetuate this myth in order to control research dollars and sell prescription drugs. Who is right? Here to help us answer this question, Dr. Robert Strecker, an internist and gastroenterologist with a PhD in pharmacology and a special interest in pathology and AIDS. He is the featured speaker in the Strecker Memorandum, a video production about the origin of AIDS. Dr. Alan Cantwell, a dermatologist and internationally known researcher in the field of cancer and AIDS microbiology. He is the author of AIDS, The Mystery and the Solution, AIDS and the Doctors of Death, and of more than 30 scientific papers on cancer, AIDS, and other immunologic diseases. John Rappoport, an investigative reporter specializing in political and environmental issues, who was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and the LA Press Club Award in 1982 for his coverage of military repression at the University of El Salvador. Mr. Rappoport has recently completed a book, AIDS, Inc., Scandal of the Century. Dr. Strecker, Mr. Rappoport, Dr. Cantwell, welcome to Summit University Forum, and thank you for being our guests. To begin with, I'd like to ask all three of you, what is AIDS? Robert?
Okay. AIDS is, the initial AIDS stand for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome. It is a disease which I feel is characterized by the presence of a particular virus, which is named now HIV, Human Immunodeficiency Virus. That virus also has other names, sometimes referred to as HTLV3, or Human T lymphotropic virus. What this virus does is it infects the human body, it infects certain cells of the body, and then proceeds to destruction of the immune system of the humans. The human immune system is comprised of two components. Basically, B cells and T cells comprise the immunological system. And this virus selectively destroys the T cell component part that aids our body in fighting infections. With the destruction of that side of the immune system, it lays the body waste and open to opportunistic infections, such as pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, or the development of cancers, such as Kaposi's sarcoma. And that is why that the disease is based upon that definition rather than the actual presence of the virus itself. In a sense, you can think of it like having tuberculosis. Some of us have tuberculosis in our lungs, and it's enclosed or encapsulated. We never actually develop tuberculosis as a disease. In this case, I think that many people who get infected, or perhaps all people who get infected with a virus, have the virus in their body, but it will proceed to destroy the immune system over a period of time. And that 100% of those who are infected, I think, will die prematurely of immune wasting. That's what AIDS is, in my opinion.
John, what's your definition of AIDS?
I think that AIDS is another word for immune suppression when you clear away some of the scientific myths about what it's supposed to be. And that if you look at AIDS in different parts of the world, you see that the kind of immune suppression that we're talking about, say in Africa or Brazil or San Francisco or Brooklyn, these are different kinds of immune suppression in that they can be caused by different factors, not all of which need to be microbial. They can be environmental. You can have chemical factors, for example, that can bring about immune suppression. Exposure to certain drugs, especially drugs that are adulterated or contaminated with very serious toxic compounds. Here I'm talking about street drugs, but also the tremendous overuse of antibiotics, for example, which has been rampant in certain pockets of the American gay community, can bring about, with certain other factors, pneumonias and serious immune suppression. So my feeling is that if you read the definitions of AIDS, and most people never bother to do that to find out what is being called AIDS these days, you find that under this convenient umbrella is now being stuffed a tremendous number of divergent diseases, symptoms, conditions caused by chemicals around the world. And these are all being lumped together in order to inflate statistics, to terrorize more and more people, and to bring about finally the triumph of the pharmaceutical industry, which has already triumphed over most of society anyway, and will continue to do so with new drugs like AZT and eventually some vaccines that probably won't work. We'll say more later, but that's starters for me on what AIDS is likely to be.
John, does a virus ever cause AIDS?
Well, I don't think that AIDS is one thing, so that we're not necessarily talking about an it called AIDS. But
Does it sometimes?
I think that a virus could cause immune suppression in some people, but probably if it does, it works with other factors to do that. And so therefore I wouldn't say that we know that a virus causes a thing called AIDS.
Alan, is AIDS primarily a homosexual disease?
There's no question that in the beginning, I mean, let's face the facts. Initially, the first several dozen patients in America were gay or bisexual. They were primarily white. They were primarily healthy. They were well educated, and they all lived in Manhattan. Since that time, the disease epidemiologically in America has spread to really, I think, include everyone who is sexual, who has basically not been mutually monogamous with a partner for over 10 years, because that is when the AIDS virus initially appeared. But I'm sure, John, you confused the audience, and I would like to confuse them further by that was an excellent question when you said, you know, how do you define AIDS? And I think it is very difficult to define, because AIDS is really two things. It is obviously a disease, because people are obviously dying of diseases that we see in front of us that are AIDS. And it is also a definition. In the beginning of the disease, for instance, the definition was primarily a pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, that awful lung pneumonia that has the potential to kill patients within days. And also a certain kind of cancer called Kaposi's sarcoma, which originally was termed gay cancer, which is a terrible term, because I would hope that there is no such thing as gay and straight cancer. I mean, I hope we don't get to that sort of consciousness. But I think it is very difficult to define AIDS. But I also think that nowadays, to define AIDS, you have to also show some evidence of the AIDS virus, because without evidence of the AIDS virus, I think that most physicians would be prone not to call something AIDS. And one other point, certainly all the diseases that comprise AIDS. In other words, when you become infected with the virus and when the virus becomes active, it basically lays the body open on the basis of immunodepression to a whole host of diseases, most of which, or all of which, have been in the textbooks for years. So I think we have to distinguish between the AIDS virus, which is new, and the disease, which basically is old. So, I mean, prior to AIDS, we had Kaposi sarcoma for 100 years without the virus. And now we have two types of Kaposi sarcoma with the virus and without. So I suppose I've completely confused you also, but it is, and I think John brings up a good point, it is very hard to define this because the definition changes from year to year. And as we know more and more about this disease, other symptoms and signs and diagnoses get added, to the AIDS definition.
Robert, is it your premise that AIDS is caused by a single virus, the HIV virus?
Yes and no. It's like Alan said. Yes, I think that AIDS is necessary it's necessary and sufficient to call AIDS in the classical sense, but there may be other viruses that can do the same sort of thing. For instance, simian virus 40, which has contaminated millions of Americans in the early 60s with the polio. That was one of in a sense, the precedent to demonstrate that this kind of phenomena can occur. Let me explain that. In 1961 or 2 or so, at the time when I got my polio vaccine, I and 65 million other Americans, along with getting polio, also got a contaminating virus that was due to a result of the virus, simian virus 40, being in kidneys, cultured cells. They grew the polio on African green monkey kidney cells, and the simian virus 40 contaminated that production. As a result, when the vaccine was given, many of us received simian virus 40. Now that virus has the potential to produce perhaps tumors in humans, perhaps cancer, and it produces it at such a delayed date that you don't really relate it to the time that I, say, got a vaccine back when I was 10 or so. But that virus also has the ability to produce immunodepression. So there may be other viruses besides AIDS, like AIDS, that can produce an exact same kind of picture. So it may end up being that there's more than just one virus that can produce it. And it's still possible, too, that AIDS produces immunodepression, or this syndrome, only in the presence of other so-called cofactors, such as maybe the presence of a simian virus 40, or the abuse of drugs, or whatever. But it's the one illustration that I would use to say that sort of cofactors don't play a large role is the fact that babies that are born with this virus that have no evidence of any other cofactor, no drug abuse, no sexual promiscuity, no SV40, they die of AIDS with an AIDS-like syndrome just the same. So I think the AIDS virus, the putative AIDS virus, will produce this disease. But, again, it's like there may be a whole new spectrum in a sense. In the case of tuberculosis, you look at the TB and you say, well, this germ produces tuberculosis. But in the case of AIDS, the virus itself doesn't produce a particular disease. It lays the body waste to allow the other diseases to march in and then destroy it. So in a sense, it sort of makes a vacant lot and other things can come in and take up housing. And that makes it very difficult to nail it down and say, well, this virus produced this disease under these circumstances, because we have all these other things that keep entering in. And it makes it very difficult to, in a sense, prove it.
It's indeed a killer, isn't it?
I think it is, yes. We've predicted that virtually 100% of the people who get the virus infection will proceed on to premature death. Now, there are many people that disagree with that, but we said that 4 years ago. Now, more and more conventional so-called experts on AIDS are now raising their estimates to say 75–90% of those who become infected will progress on to AIDS, a disease, or some kind of other complicating disease.
Well, something else that you've said that interests me is that AIDS was predicted, requested, produced, and deployed. Briefly, what are you saying?
Right. If you go back and if you review the medical literature in 1972 or 73 or so, Jay Clemenson, and we'll bring it up later, but basically Jay Clemenson, who was a world-renowned epidemiologist, was speaking before an international group of cancer researchers. And in that summation speech, she said that get ready because you're going to have a worldwide pandemic of a cancer-causing virus. So, in a sense, that was the prediction of the AIDS pandemic. And we'll get into it later also, but there are other things besides AIDS that we should be aware of that are perhaps coming. Requested is that the fact that in 1972, at the same time frame in the same time period, before AIDS actually broke out in the United States in 78, the World Health Organization, writing in its papers, said, let's make a virus that destroys the T-cell system of man. So is it now mere coincidence that that virus appears on the scene?
Would you mind repeating that?
Right. In 1972, the World Health Organization, if you go back, remember there are two systems, the B-cell system and the T-cell system. The B-cell system is the lymphocytic system that basically controls bacterial infections and produces antibodies in conjunction with the big cell called a macrophage. The T-cell system was thought to be the system that controlled opportunistic infections such as pneumocystis carinii pneumonia and the production of cancer such as Kaposi sarcoma. So the thinking was, they were trying to sort out the T-cell and the B-cell system and see what each part did and how they interacted. So they said, if we make an agent that destroys the T-cell system, we can see what happens. Of course, that's exactly what AIDS is, and exactly what it does is you see what happens. You get cancers and you get opportunistic infections. Now, they wrote that down in 1972. The question then is, how is this virus produced? You see people then say, well, no, they didn't have all these genetically engineering techniques available back in the early 70s. And we use the illustration here of like a baby with no arms or legs. If a baby with no arms or legs got dressed up in a tuxedo and went to a party, he didn't do it by himself. The same thing with the AIDS virus. We say, well, there are two possibilities. The virus makes itself, which of course all the scientists say, no, that's not possible. Well, then you're left with the other option, and that is, of course, somebody made it. So if you want to assume somebody made it, you've already agreed with this. Then you're left with the actual fact is that the virus makes itself. And so in a sense, the virus manufactured itself. It's its own engineer, it's its own creator, provided you put the right components together. And the minute you say that, you see, you don't have to implicate genetic engineering techniques. The virus manufactures itself. So all you have to do is put the right components together, and it will create itself. And that, of course, makes every laboratory suspect throughout the world at all times, provided they had those components together. And practically every laboratory that was working with culture media had those components in its laboratory. But the scientists don't want you to think that's possible, because then they're all suspect. And of course, they don't want anybody mucking around, looking over what they're doing and seeing what they're making. So then, once the virus makes itself, you see you're left then with how did it get into humans? So there are really basically, in my opinion, two possibilities. One, it was accidentally injected as a contaminant of some vaccine culture, which is another thing that Jay Clemenson predicted in 1972. She said all that would occur because of a vaccine contamination. Or two, it was simply tested. They may have taken it out and injected it in a group of people and said, let's see what happens. Let's see if this actually causes cancer. And that's certainly not above, possible realm. So that's sort of a capsule summary of how we view this problem.
Bearing that in mind, Alan, tell us briefly why you think AIDS is a form of biological warfare.
Well, first of all, I'm basically a dermatologist, but for years I have had a great interest in looking for bacteria. Bacteria are microbes that you can see under the microscope. And you know Dr. Virginia Livingston Wheeler, who I think spoke a year or two ago with her husband Owen. And for, gosh, a quarter of a century, I have really been a student of Virginia's. And I believe very strongly in her work regarding certain microbes in cancer, which basically have been completely ignored by the medical establishment, because they believe that there is no microbe in cancer that you can see. So that before AIDS actually came to the fore in 1981, I had already spent several years studying various forms of cancer, certain other immunologic diseases. And interestingly enough, I had been studying Kaposi sarcoma, the type of cancer that became, at the very beginning, the hallmark of AIDS in gay men. For instance, they would get these purple skin blotches, tumors. And on biopsy, the pathologist would say, well, this is Kaposi sarcoma, and people would scratch their head because that was a very, very rare type of cancer. And usually the people that got it were older, and they tended to be either Italians or Mediterraneans or older Jewish men. But to see that kind of cancer in young, healthy men just sort of appear out of the blue, along with these other opportunistic infections and in terribly sick people. That was very unique. So at the very beginning, I said to myself, well, I think what we're dealing here is basically with a new form of cancer, one that undoubtedly has this cancer microbe, because when I studied the tissue in Kaposi's from several patients of mine who were elderly Jewish men, it just so happened they were all Jewish. I mean, I could find this microbe that Dr. Livingston talked about, and I could grow the microbe, and I saw it in the tissue. And so when I first began to study the tissue of gay men with Kaposi's sarcoma, which at that point was the hallmark. In other words, if you saw Kaposi's sarcoma, you said to yourself, well, this patient has AIDS. And when I looked under the microscope, I saw the same germ that that I had seen in the Kaposi's sarcoma and the elderly men before the epidemic, and I knew from the very beginning that this new disease, AIDS, was, in my opinion, basically a new form of cancer. And I kept insisting that was at least involved in this strongly until they discovered the AIDS virus. And then I thought, oh my goodness, no one is paying any attention to these cancer microbes, which they haven't for decades. And I knew from the beginning there was more to AIDS than the AIDS virus, because I could see these germs so easily. And we can show some of those slides if the time is appropriate or when it is appropriate, and I can show you the kind of thing. And so, but it never dawned on me about this new AIDS virus, because I thought, well, maybe this virus was in some way related to these cancer microbes. So in 1986, when I met Bob Strecker, and here he's talking about AIDS, the virus, this biological warfare, I'm going, no, I don't. That's insane. But over a period of time and with study, Strecker really opened my mind, to a whole other piece of the puzzle. That we basically had two things going here. We had this cancer microbe, which nobody sees but me and Virginia and a few others. And then we have the possibility that we had a biologic accident. Whether it was deliberate or not, we could talk about that. So we basically had two things going here. And that's why we have basically old diseases coming to the fore, with a new biologic agent, so that you're getting people that are dying 30 and 40 and 50 and 60 years before their time. So it really opened my mind to a whole aspect of this. Nobody likes to think that biological warfare is taking place in front of your eyes and nobody sees it. This is very, disturbing.
Well, who would have thought that the last plagues prophesied in the book of Revelation would come upon us so suddenly and so desperately in this epidemic? And you, John, talking to us about a science bureaucracy and some financial interests promoting a single cause theory of this plague rather than simply looking for a cure for a terrible disease.
Yeah. This is the medical model. There's one disease, there's one germ, and there's one cure. This is what we're all set up to believe. And even if we don't believe it, we're outnumbered or outflanked by the pharmaceutical industry and the medical research establishment, because the program is a doctor finds what he thinks is a new disease. Doctors that are ambitious, let's face it, like to find new diseases. That's just a fact of life, Any doctors in the audience? So they find them. And if there weren't any there, they would find them anyway.
Well, they might make it.
They might make a few. That's right.
Our guests are exceptions.
Yes. Present company accepted. So, starting from that premise, if you were a pharmaceutical executive sitting high up in your penthouse looking down on the rest of humanity, you would say, this doctor has discovered a new disease. I wonder what germ causes the disease. And the reason you would be wondering that is because you would be thinking about what drug might kill the germ that causes the disease, naturally. And so if this doctor, who's bucking for awards, grant money, fame, fortune, were suddenly to say, well, this is a funny disease. We've got viruses, we've got bacteria, we've got chemicals, we've got, God knows, there's a lot of factors involved here. And in fact, the manifestations in people are not necessarily caused by the same things in everybody. You, as the pharmaceutical executive, would say, well, wait a minute. If that's the case, how can we develop a drug that's going to, stamp out this disease? Because then we would be talking about something that's not even a disease in the classical sense. We would be talking about a condition. And so you, as the pharmaceutical executive, would say, we can't have this. We want a doctor that's going to find a disease that's got a single germ. Let's find, such a man. If this guy down here is not our boy, let's find somebody who is. And this is how, in what I would call the economic model of the medical system, this factor is always at play. Whether it's AIDS, cancer, polio, whatever. Muscular dystrophy, How many conditions are involved in muscular dystrophy? Or is cancer really the name of a single thing? Are you kidding? Is AIDS the name of something which is simultaneously killing off somebody who's starving in Africa and a junkie in San Francisco who's got a hold of a drug that is going to give him a severe reaction that's contaminated with something that can give him Parkinson's disease in one shot? Are we talking about the same condition? You see, and people start to say, well, wait a minute, I'm getting a little confused here. Well, let me put it to you this way, because I know sort of a little background about this gathering, and that is, when Jesus Christ came along, way back there, and then did what he did and then died, some other people came along and said, guess what? There is one disease for all of humanity, and that is called the fall from grace, and there is one cure, and that is believing that Jesus Christ is your salvation. And to prove it, we're going to pull you all into this religion, and if you don't come in, we're not going to like you. Okay? In fact, we might do you in if you protest too loudly. So we have the disease, the fall from grace, the one and only cure, Jesus will save you. And so, you see, this is the model of society that gets imposed. So if we believe the same thing medically, and we say every time there's an outbreak of something, it's only one cause, we're going to get the same result, one cure. And if the people that are delivering that cure are very top-flight pharmaceutical people, we're going to get a drug. We're going to get several drugs for different diseases. And this is not necessarily healthy, believe me. Trust me.
If they believe in the drug, will they be saved?
Love your surgeon as he cuts you apart. You say, yes, I'm in love with you, you're going to take out my liver, it's no problem. Because I love you, everything will be fine. It's possible. I mean, I think some people, in fact, do survive certain drugs because they do love their doctors. And if they didn't love their doctors, there would be a lot more people dying of those drugs than there are. So yes, it'll keep you going for a while anyway.
Well, let's deal with one cause and deal with it right now, and that is your answer, each of you, to the question, what about the green monkey? Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, well, actually at this point, there are very few people, even in so-called traditional medicine, that believe that the virus came from monkeys. I I think that that came from the fact that they got away with the infliction of simian virus 40 on millions of Americans back in the early 60s. And so they said, well, in a sense, well, it was sort of convenient and useful once, we'll use that theory again. The reason that we say that the virus, actually, if you accept the fact that the putative AIDS virus causes AIDS, which in this case we will for the moment, it didn't come from monkeys. It didn't come from monkeys for various reasons. First off, in Africa, the pygmies, who have been mostly closely associated with the monkeys, haven't had AIDS up until the last recent months when they got contaminated from city dwellers.
Well, is it from the monkey or the bite?
Yeah, well, that's another question. Where did it come from? Right, somebody biting somebody on the bottom and bam, AIDS all over Africa. That's another problem. You know.
I know it's the green monkey that did the biting.
Right, yeah, well, in this case we'd have to have a real big one because he infected a lot of people at first. So, and also in Africa, the disease AIDS in Africa broke out in the cities, not in the country. Again, it doesn't fit epidemiologically with what you would expect. The strongest evidence that we say that the virus actually didn't come from monkeys is the fact that if you look at the genetic makeup of the AIDS virus, the genes of the AIDS virus, the genetic information encoded in the virus itself is not present in man or primates. So we believe it's not only improbable, it's impossible that the virus came from monkeys or man or primates. It came, in our opinion, from bovine leukemia virus and Visna virus, the great destroyer of sheep. So we think it's genetically impossible. And now, of course, everybody says, oh, it didn't come from monkeys. So that's my theory of where it didn't come from.
Ditto?
Ditto. I think that what makes this particularly absurd is that, as both Dr. Cantwell and Dr. Strecker have been pointing out, there was this polio vaccine made out of green monkey kidneys that people, you know, some of you, millions and millions of Americans got injected with before 1962. That's how they cultured the vaccine. We have green monkeys in labs all over the world running around being experimented on, poked, kicked, tortured to death every day. Lab handlers getting bit. But when people come along and say it was the green monkey, they immediately go to deepest, darkest Africa. They don't go to the polio vaccine. They don't want to talk about that. They don't want to go to the lab because these are the holy of holies of the medical profession. That cannot be disturbed. So let's go to Africa where all strange things begin. This is the cliche, see? That's the trip, right? Right on. And I will tell you that the World Health Organization has been making a major PR effort to win back these African countries into the fold, who are very angry because they say over there AIDS came from America. And the World Health Organization wants to impose their treatment plan on these African countries, and so they're making nice now. They want to give them AZT, which is probably going to, would be a disaster. And so you see, it's another myth. We have the myth. Life began in Africa. Isn't that what we learned in evolution? So a disease began in Africa. You know, it's that kind of thinking. And people shake their heads and they say, yeah, that makes sense to me. Of course, Africa, we don't know what's going on there. But if you say Manhattan, people say Manhattan, they say, well, Manhattan is all cement. Where is the grass? Germs grow in the grass. And really, this is the level of the thinking. I mean, you may think, well, he's making a joke, it's very funny, but let's get down to serious science. As both of these gentlemen can point out, and I can point out as well, the science that came to that conclusion is absurd. And now Luc Montagnier, who is the co-discoverer of HIV, and Jonathan Mann, who is the spokesman for AIDS of the World Health Organization, have both publicly said that there is no good proof that the HIV virus originated in Africa with monkeys. They have said that in Europe. But in the United States, these articles are not printed in the newspaper in the front page. It doesn't go on TV at night because of one simple reason, and that is that the reporters in this country, of whom I am one, but not like many others, they get their science information from press officers at the National Institutes of Health and the CDC. And since those people have not told them that AIDS doesn't come from Africa, they don't believe the statements made in Europe, you see. They just say, well, that's Europe. And they don't want to antagonize these press people at the Centers for Disease Control, because then they won't be invited to these special press briefings. They won't be able to go to the Bahamas for medical conferences. Remember that guy from the time? You know.
We were actually told by a major newspaper reporter that he couldn't tell the American people the truth if we were in fact correct, because of course then he wouldn't be able to go to his conferences, which were being held in great places like Bimini and, you know, tropical islands and places that he liked to go. So we had met with him and given him a ton of information, and he simply refused to even consider it because it would destroy his opportunity to go to some of these places. Now, if you look at reporters, John, it's a truth that they, instead of reading for themselves, and the information that we have put out or that we have available in our books and tapes and things, all we really have ever asked anybody to do is to go down there, read it for yourself, and decide for yourself. It's not that complicated. It's not impossible to get on top of this for yourself.
Right. Even I could understand it.
Yes, yeah. So, and then one of the things I mentioned at this point, John, we're talking about monkeys, and that is both of us have become aware. If you go back and you look at what was happening in laboratory creatures in the early 70s and mid-70s, a lot of the monkeys that were experimented on were shipped back to Africa and released.
Oh, no.
So, is it so shocking that you now can go to Africa and find a monkey that might be contaminated with a particular kind of a virus? It has no reason whatsoever to conclude that that virus evolved naturally in those monkeys. And if you believe that these agents are infectious, which I do, then there's no reason to believe that other monkeys might contain them. So if you go back and research and see what actually happened to monkeys in the early 70s, published in the New York Times, John's aware of, I'm aware of, you can find articles about what they were doing with the animals they experimented on, and particularly monkeys, chimps, baboons. A lot of them were shipped back to Africa and released in some kind of humane program. Of course, now in 1989, they run over to Africa, in 1988, they run over to Africa, and they take a monkey and they find something and say, wow, you know, it was there 100 million years ago. Well, it doesn't prove that at all. So, that's something that you have to keep in mind when you talk about the green monkey theory.
Alan, have we exhausted that, or
well,
do you
one
have
thing
something
about Bob
to
is, you know, he's always, and the reason I think that he's a good guy and a bright man is that he is always 2 or 3 years ahead of everyone else. And I think, you know, if you listen to the experts, they usually tell you what Strecker says a couple of years later. And when I first met Strecker, I mean, everyone was absolutely convinced in the sanctity of the idea that the green monkey, you know, was the cause of AIDS in Africa. And I'm convinced that AIDS is from monkey business, but I think coming from monkeys. And I think it brings up a very interesting point, of course, because and here you can see an article in the LA Times last month, the research refutes idea that human AIDS viruses originated in monkeys. And of course, then the question is, well, if the Africans didn't get it from the monkeys, you know, where did they get it? And that, of course, brings up, I think, the idea of the smallpox inoculations. And a year or two ago in London, in the London Times, there was an article that attempted to relate the AIDS epidemic in Africa to the possibility that the mass inoculations with smallpox may have then resulted in an immunodepression in millions of Africans, which then theoretically activated this dormant AIDS virus, which we now know didn't come from the monkeys. And so you're still back to where did the Africans get this virus? And I think if it didn't come from the green monkey, where did it come from? And this whole concept that AIDS originated in Africa, I think, is pure and simple racist science. You know, I really do. I think it's... I think it's the same sort of, you know, racist science that equates, you know, the disease with gay people and all that stuff. And the same sort of thing that equated the Nazi purge, you know, of the Jews. It's that kind of thinking. And so AIDS, I think most people who are sensitive now realize that AIDS didn't really, at least in America, come from Africa. So again, you have to ask, well, if it didn't come from Africa, where did it come from? Well, first, all the experts said, well, it was introduced into Africa in the late 70s. Now, it's interesting because the epidemic started in Manhattan around the same time it started in Africa. So we got more monkey business going on here. If you think about it, here the government tells you we have this tremendous heterosexual black epidemic that in some mysterious way transformed itself into a white homosexual epidemic. Now, how is that possible? There's no biologic way that could be.
Well, how did this microbe, which is affecting heterosexuals in Africa, as many as 75 to 150 million, all of a sudden appear in white, English-speaking homosexuals in Manhattan? That's a pretty spectacular change.
Well, before we try to answer that question, let's settle a few basics so we can build our good foundation. It's a disorder of the immune system, we have agreed. That's what AIDS is. Dr. Strecker, give us a lesson and tell us what is the immune system.
Well, the immune system is the part of your body, and in fact it's very difficult to break it apart, but it's the part of your body that protects you against foreign elements, foreign agents, bacteria, viruses, microbes, fungi, other people, anything that you don't really perceive as self. It's what really, it's why you can't transfer skin from John to me. If we put it on, my body rejects it. In a sense, the immune system's job is to reject foreign elements, whether they be skin from John, viruses from an injection, bacteria that you ingested, or whatever. So, and it has components that are both cellular, comprised of polymorphonuclear leukocytes that walk around your body and kill things, to macrophages that are like giant processing plants. It's kind of like a rendering plant, where the macrophage's job is to take a microbe and process it like a rendering plant processes a cow and puts out the finished product on the other end. The macrophage processes the virus or bacteria and then feeds it to B lymphocytes or T lymphocytes, which is the other part of the immune system components. And B lymphocytes make antibodies, which are directed against bacteria, basically, or T lymphocytes, which kill cancer cells or destroy fungi or other opportunistic infections. So that's sort of an overview of what the immune system is and what it's supposed to do. But you can't really separate that from your skin, which keeps out certain things, or from your nasal passages, which has cilia and mucus, which trap certain things. So, your immune system is really that part of your body which job is to differentiate you from everything else.
It ought to be your armor.
It is. It should be. Right.
And when it ceases to function as such, you are undefended.
That's right. That's exactly what happens in this disease. The virus, the AIDS virus, comes in and sets about to destroy the actual armor that you're using to protect yourself. And when there's no more armor, then anybody can walk right in and take over.
Thank you for that definition. Alan, give us your definition of what is a virus.
Let Bob, he's much better at that.
Okay.
Okay, well, a virus is really the smallest self-replicating microorganism. It's comprised of either RNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. RNA is ribonucleic acid. So viruses are really just little pieces of genetic information, little coat around them. Some people call them bad news in a sugar coat. So viruses, in a sense, are the smallest self-replicating pieces of genetic information. Now, it goes back a long time, and really one of the things that really you should walk away with, I think, besides the fact that at least I feel that this virus came out of a laboratory, is the fact that there's an integral relationship between what's gone on in cancer research and the sudden appearance of a lot of these things. And the whole question centers around viruses, what causes cancer, and what's the role of pleomorphic organisms. But back to the virus question, the theory has always been that viruses only can reproduce themselves in living tissue, whereas anything bigger like bacteria or yeast, you can make a culture plate and actually grow it outside of a living tissue. But viruses must grow in living cells. Now, what makes that particularly dangerous is the fact that in the case of this AIDS virus, or other viruses like it, when they grow in certain types of cells, they tend to adapt themselves to that cellular tissue. So that in the case of AIDS, for instance, if you started with a virus that was maybe cattle in origin, and you grew it in human tissue, you may end up with a virus that is more like humans and will no longer grow in cattle. It might only grow in humans. So viruses are the smallest self-replicating pieces of genetic information that grow in living tissue.
AIDS is said to be a retrovirus.
Right, retro.
What's a retrovirus?
Well, retro actually, officially, or I guess unofficially, stands for the fact that the virus contains an enzyme known as reverse transcriptase. So when you look at the AIDS virus, contained in its sugar and genetic information, it's an RNA virus comprised of ribonucleic acid. There are the presence of these little protein balls, which are reverse transcriptase, and their function is, and this virus infects, say, a human being, that reverse transcriptase copies the RNA into a DNA form. So it changes it. It's like it's RNA here, but to get inserted into your genes, it has to be in the DNA form, because the genetic makeup of humans is DNA. So the virus, being RNA, cannot insert itself directly. It has to change. So the reverse transcriptase changes it to DNA and inserts it into the human being, or whatever animal it's growing in. Now the retro stands for, RE stands for reverse, and the TRO stands for transcriptase. But I actually prefer to think of retro in the following sense. It represents the retrograde flow of information. Because one of the fundamental theories of biology has always been that information flowed from the DNA out to the periphery. In other words, your genetic makeup was fixed, and you could only produce what was contained within. So that was sort of a basic theory of how information came from your genes, DNA, was sent by messenger out to the periphery to make proteins, and that was the only way information could flow. However, now, of course, genetic engineers use these viruses to retrograde, introduce information. They can send it in. It's the same as if, for people who are familiar with computers, as if you took a read-only memory computer, which is fixed, and it instantly changed it into a random access memory so that you could put in and take out and put in and take out. That's what these viruses allow the genetic engineer to do. He can put in information and put it in and see what comes out. So I prefer to think of retro as meaning retrograde flow of information. So you're actually modifying the gene pool. And that, of course, is what this virus is going to do. It's already done to human species. It's going to modify our gene pool.
Does it require someone to cause this to happen?
No, the virus will do it on itself. As again, go back, the virus makes itself. So you don't have to do it. Of course, if you modify it, it will do it, in a sense, will carry it in for you. But the virus will spontaneously interact with what it grows in. The organism is chameleon-like. These organisms, the retrovirus family, are chameleon-like, and they adapt to whatever they're growing in. So that, like if you put a chameleon on a blue coat, it becomes blue. If you put this virus into a human being, it becomes a little bit like a human. Or if you put it into a cow, it becomes a little bit like a cow. And so if you do that a large number of times, it becomes more and more and more like whatever you're growing it in. It's a random number generator. It's sort of just spontaneously interacting with its environment all the time.
It sounds like an invading arch-fiend that
In a sense, that's absolutely...
is capable of performing its function anywhere.
That's right. That's exactly correct. It's awesome.
Are there other human retroviruses besides the AIDS virus?
Yeah, there are. There's a whole, in fact, I think that we're going to have a whole explosion of retroviral-induced diseases. Not just AIDS, but we'll get to it later, but we'll draw some pictures that will make it clear. But there are HTLV1, which is human T-cell leukemia virus, which is infectious. There's HTLV2, which is human T-cell leukemia virus number 2, which produces hairy cell leukemia. There's HTLV4, or now known as HIV2, which is a newly discovered retrovirus of humans that supposedly came from monkeys again, which causes AIDS in a slower form. There's HTLV5, which is an infectious mycosis or a leukemia virus of humans that's been recently described. And there's a whole group of other new, perhaps viral diseases that are exploding upon the scene. So, in a sense, if you just throw out AIDS for the amendment, if you get rid of that, then you must say, where did all these other things just all of a sudden appear from? I mean, what monkey did they come from? And how do they appear at the same time running in human beings simultaneously? You know, if you envision two monkeys biting somebody on the bottom in Africa at the same time, you know, I mean, it gets a little ridiculous after a while. So there's going to be an explosion of so-called retrovirally induced disease. We'll be discovering more and more viruses that are carrying leukemias, cancer, and perhaps what I call dissolving diseases or connective tissue diseases, such as lupus and other things.
Did you say that animals also get retroviruses?
Yes, I think in fact that's where this virus came from. I think that the human AIDS virus came from the combination of two animal viruses. Animals have known to have these diseases for a long period of time. Exactly how long depends upon whom you believe. Some of the so-called experts would tell us millions of years, but I actually believe it may not be quite so long. Maybe it's just a few decades. Well, anyway, if they're off by 1%, it puts it within the range of a few 100,000, so maybe we're not too far off. But if you go back and you look at the history of retroviral diseases, it began with Rouse in 1911 or so when he was working with his chickens. And I know that you have been working with trying to clean up your chickens here. Throughout the world, chickens, because again, they've been produced in mass production, have now carry as a group mostly a virus that will cause cancer or leukemia.
In humans.
In humans, perhaps, yes. And that virus, which Rouse eventually got into a form in 1912 or 13 or so, here's what actually happened. It's not just Rouse got a chicken and he got out a virus that caused cancer. Rouse got a chicken that had a cancer in it. He passaged that cancer initially in cellular form only. In other words, he could only transfer the cancer from the first chicken by transferring cells. And it would only grow in near relatives. So he passaged it for many passages in near relatives, and then he eventually got it so that cellular cancer would grow in non-relatives. He passaged that for a while and eventually got out a virus that would cause cancer when he injected it into chickens. Now, he concluded, of course, that the virus caused the cancer. But there's one other conclusion, which is, in my opinion, the actual truth. And that is, of course, that the cancer caused the virus. So, just because, in a sense, that you can take a virus that carries a cancer gene with it and cause a cancer in another chicken, it doesn't prove that the virus was actually the cause of the cancer. As an illustration, we always use the fact that, you know, if you had an electrical system in a house and a dysfunction and your house burned down, somebody could run over to your house and get a shovel of coals and throw it on the house next door and that house would burn down. But it didn't burn down because the electrical system in that house failed or because the electrical system in your house failed. It burned down because somebody carried those flames over there and threw it on the house. In the same sense, I think in effect what's happening here is these viruses have the ability to transduce little pieces of genetic information. So in the case that I have a cancer, if the virus in me picks up that little piece of information and now infects John, he's going to get that cancer. But it doesn't mean that the virus caused the cancer. It merely transduced the information over to him, and so he now gets it. But the virus didn't cause it. It could have been the fact that I was drinking benzene, or the fact that I got irradiated with radiation, or many, many, many other factors. But the virus is, in a sense, the amplifier. Again, another illustration is like saying, well, you're going to destroy your radio, and that will get rid of the radio signal. The signal's still there. The radio is merely the amplifier. In this case, the virus is merely the amplifier, and the signal is that little piece of genetic information that carries the scheme for, say, cancer, or for AIDS, or for connective tissue dissolving disease, or for whatever, you know, disaster it wants to pick up. And that, in my opinion, is how these things are really carrying this information over and what we're really dealing with.
Are you ready to diagram for us how the AIDS virus was produced out of the two?
Do we have a blackboard yet?
Yes.
Okay. If you look at what's happening in human beings today, here's what's really happening. All of a sudden we have this virus. I'll draw a picture of it here. This is a so-called C-type retrovirus, an oncovirus. It causes cancer. This virus happens to cause T-cell leukemia in humans. We also have HTLV2, which looks like this. This virus causes hairy cell leukemia in humans. And we have this virus growing which is a so-called D type. It's a different type. It looks different. I mean, it doesn't look anything like these. In fact, these two don't look the same either. This is HTLV3, or AIDS virus. We have HTLV4, which has this appearance, which is another AIDS virus. And we have HTLV5, which causes mycosis fungoides, another infectious leukemia virus, cancer virus of humans. And so you say to yourself, where did all this come from? I mean, how did all these things suddenly appear? If you look in cattle, there's this virus, which is growing in cattle, which is named bovine leukemia virus. It has the exact same appearance, that means morphology or shape. It has the same molecular weight. It has the same magnesium dependency. It has the same reverse transcriptase-like components. It's a retrovirus of cattle. It looks the same, it walks the same, and it causes T cell and B cell leukemia of cattle. We have this virus growing in cattle, which is named bovine syncytial virus, which has the exact same appearance as this virus. It has the same molecular weight, the same magnesium dependency. It causes hairy cell leukemia of cattle. This one causes hairy cell leukemia of humans. So we have this virus growing in cattle, which we now know as HTLV3, which is the AIDS virus. And in cattle, you say, well, you know, could you find a virus of cattle that looks like this? Well, sure enough, there is. And that virus, if you look at AIDS, every paper written on AIDS, there isn't any paper that says this virus came out of monkeys. Every paper written on the genetic makeup, these little genes here, say that the genes of the AIDS virus look like either bovine leukemia virus, this one, number one, or Visna virus, which looks like this. Visna virus, which is the great retroviral destroying disease of sheep. Now, some people have said that Visna was sent to Iceland in 1939 as a biological warfare experiment of the Germans. And as a result of that, for whatever reason, Visna did appear in about 39 or 1940 in Iceland. The Icelandic sheep became infected. They were subsequently discovered. They eliminated all the sheep that they could. A few years later, it came back. They went through the whole island again, eliminated all the sheep that they could that were infected. A few years later, it was back. So finally, they just destroyed all the sheep in the entire island and started over. So if you look at the genetic makeup of AIDS, this virus contains genes that reflect either BLV or Visna. So if you were going to name a virus, what would you name it? Well, we ran a Medline search on viruses. We looked for Visna bovine virus and bovine Visna virus. And sure enough, there was a virus named bovine Visna virus, which has the same appearance as AIDS. It has the same molecular weight, the same morphology, the same magnesium dependency. It contains reverse transcriptase. And this virus was growing in cattle and producing pneumocystis carinii pneumonia in chimpanzees in 1974. So, you know, to us, it's really not a big revelation to say, well, these viruses really came out of cattle and sheep. So you're left with one question yet, and that is, in a sense, how could this virus of humans, say bovine leukemia virus, if you had bovine leukemia virus, or this virus, bovine Visna virus, growing in cattle, if it's here in cattle, how could you make this virus grow in humans? So this gets back to the question of, again, why is it that if it's only now that we see these things growing in humans? Many people have been bitten by, say, monkeys. It's interesting to note that the so-called AIDS experts tell us that monkeys bit somebody on the butt in Africa, and then we have AIDS all over Africa, and yet they tell us in this country that bites are not infectious. It's quite interesting. Well, so how do you get these viruses that are growing in animals to grow in humans? You can argue that it's a simple cross-species transference, but the real crux of the question is, how do you get a virus, say, of cattle or sheep or monkeys or anything else to grow in humans? Now, the fact is that if you serially passage this virus in human tissue, that what they proved in 1972 in a paper by Stuart Aronson called Common Genetic Alterations of RNA Tumor Viruses, in 1972, Stuart Aronson took mouse viruses, little mouse here, he took a virus out of this mouse and grew it in human tissue and discovered that what he got out over here would now grow preferentially in humans and would no longer grow in mice. So if you serially passage these viruses in human tissue, you can adapt them to grow in humans, and they will no longer grow and say where they came from, either cattle or sheep or whatever. Well, these viruses have been growing in human tissue since around 72 to 73 or even earlier. Bovine leukemia virus and bovine Visna virus. So, in a sense, we think that that's the explanation for the origin and explosion of these diseases. Now, how did they get into humans? Well, there are two ways that they could have gotten into humans again. If you look at the way vaccines are prepared, most cultures are prepared with fetal calf serum. Now, fetal calf serum is like the growth hormone for culture media. So no matter what you're growing in tissue culture, remember viruses grow in living tissue. They don't grow on plates that have been, in a sense, maybe sterilized, such as with bacterial culture plates. You can make bacterial culture. You can make a bacterial culture plate and put it into an autoclave and sterilize this such that nothing organic could be left. But viruses grow in living tissue, so if you autoclave your tissue before you try to grow the virus, then of course it doesn't work. So you have to grow these things in living tissue. So they dump in the virus, they dump in the cells, and then they dump in a bunch of other stuff. Fetal calf serum is one they like to use. Alan found a concoction comprised of a chicken heart that was ground up, beef parts, placentas from other animals, these viruses in these cells, so you get a giant combination. Well, anyway, as it turns out, this fetal calf serum is contaminated with all of these cattle viruses. So it's not surprising, you say, that you might have this stuff, growing in some kind of human or other vaccine that's used. Now, that's a possible accidental contamination. There's another way it could have occurred, and that is the following. Here's a cow, and the way they make a smallpox vaccine was they took cattle. Most of the smallpox vaccine that was used in the eradication of smallpox throughout the world was actually produced in Russia. But it was actually, the smallpox came from 46 countries in the following manner. They take a cow, they shave its belly, they put on a group of slices with a razor, they drip on the vaccinia, they put it in stanchions so that it cannot lick its belly. They come back a week or two later, they put underneath a stainless steel container, they scrape off the scabs, they collect the effluent, they dry it out, and that's your next smallpox vaccine. So, it's not hard to see how a virus such as these could be contaminating this kind of production. Now, in Monday, May 11th, 1987, on the front page of the London Times was an article which said that perhaps the smallpox campaign in Africa had resulted in the outbreak of AIDS there. The other way it could have ended up in humans once you made it is, of course, it could have just been tested. You
just kind of drop that little hint. How did this combo of bovine leukemia virus and Visna virus become, as you see it, the AIDS virus? And how was it introduced into humans?
Yeah, well, go back to the board here a second. If you remember, we mentioned before, in 1972, writing the Bulletin of the World Health Organization, I'll put it down here, Bulletin of the World Health Organization, 1972, page 257. If you look there, there was an article written that says basically, let's make a T-cell destroying virus. Because we'll see what happens. Let's see what happens when we wipe out the T-cells. So, if you were a scientist, and they knew that they had this virus, which was bovine leukemia virus, which was a T-cell trophic. In other words, this virus attacks T-cells. It goes to T-cells and it causes them to proliferate. So in a sense, it makes them grow. If you have a culture with this virus in it, if you put the virus in, the culture media grows and grows and grows. It's like, the thing that we all hope for. Pretty soon you have to take gas out so your car will keep running rather than keep putting it in. This virus makes these things grow. So you have to take cells out, or it becomes overpopulated. The same thing happens in humans. It causes T-cell leukemia. When it grows in humans, you get a leukemia. Same thing with HTLV2, or bovine syncytial virus. This is another proliferative virus in tissue culture. So they said, we have this virus, which we know attacks T and B cells. Why don't we cross it with this virus, the great destroyer of sheep, Visna virus, and see what happens? Now, that either occurred intentionally, they put those two together, in a sense, in a tissue culture, and out popped AIDS, or in an animal, and out popped AIDS. So if you take bovine leukemia virus here, and you take Visna virus here, and you put these two together, you get this. Now people, this is one of the things that told us that they were lying right from the start, is they said, well, this can't occur. But that's the very nature of the retrovirus organism. Its very nature is to experiment within itself, to create new pathogens, to try new combinations. So if you put bovine leukemia virus with Visna together intentionally, you will produce not only this virus, bovine leukemia virus, and this virus, Visna virus, out of that culture. You will produce all billions and billions of the recombinants. It's like this. They say, well, this virus, AIDS, is only 50% identical to bovine leukemia virus and is only 50% identical to Visna virus. And so it can't possibly be the parent here. That's like saying you're only 50% identical to your mother and you're only 50% identical to your father. So they can't possibly be your parents. So, now, this virus, in a sense, was produced, in my opinion, either intentionally by mixing these two, or it could be that it just exists accidentally as a result, again, of mixture of these viruses in nature. If you go back to 1950 in Europe, in the 50s, one of the things that they were doing was vaccinating sheep and cattle, and particularly sheep, with beef serum. So they were vaccinating sheep with beef serum to prevent the development of a disease known as pyroplasmosis. I'm sure some of the farmers know what pyroplasmosis is. Well, obviously, you see, if you now allow these viruses to get together in a cow, they will do the same thing. And in nature, they, of course, have been growing all kinds of things together besides bovine leukemia virus and Visna virus in tissue cultures, either intentionally or accidentally, for at least 20 years. So, to me, it's not shocking that it happens. What's shocking to me is that it hasn't happened before.
I'd like to know if this virus, this new virus, the combination of the two, is actually the virus discovered by Dr. Gallo and Montagnier.
Well, I think that it is, but I mean, the question is, has it been around for a long time before the discovery? Perhaps maybe it existed in the laboratory for a lot longer than the recent discovery. Again, the fact that when it grows in humans, it's a little bit different. You see, you can honestly say, well, this is not the same virus that's growing in cattle. Well, of course not, because it's growing in humans. So even if it's 95% identical, it's not 100%. But the truth of the matter is that every virus that grows, all of these viruses, in a sense, will be different. The nature of the virus is to recombine. It's to experiment with itself. One of the things that we have said is that, if you believe that the virus was originated in Africa and transported there by the Portuguese, it proves that the world was flat. And I'll tell you how we come to that conclusion. Now, this is Africa, and this is Japan. Over here is the United States. Now, the experts tell us that the Portuguese took this virus to Japan. We're talking about HTLV1 and or 3. They took this virus to Japan in the 1500s, and then they took it back to the, these viruses evolved in Japan and in Africa and in Haiti, 3 independent areas of the world. It evolved spontaneously to produce HTLV1, T-cell leukemia of humans, and AIDS. Now, the important thing is that you must realize that proves the world is flat, because there's no AIDS in Portugal, so obviously all the sailors fell off at the end of the world. None of them got back home, first off. And second off, These viruses, which contain genes that are 9,000 base pairs long, in other words, there are 9,000 little slots here, and each base pair has 4 choices. So over the years, since it's put there in the 1500s, it's now 1988. So if you subtract 1500, you get 488. So the viruses that evolved spontaneously in 3 isolated areas of the world would be 488 years later, 488% different. Yet the isolates contained from these areas are virtually identical. So it proves that the viruses cannot have been present there, knowing they spontaneously mutate 1% a year for more than a few years. Now, this also has other implications. The viruses that were discovered so far, every AIDS virus that has been discovered so far in human beings has been different. There are no 2 that are identical. The only 2 that have been identical were Dr. Gallo's and Dr. Montagnier's, and that's another story. But you know, it makes you wonder how that these 2 guys discovered an identical virus when you know that they spontaneously change or mutate when they're growing in humans. If you look at this, 9,000, and each one has 4 combinations, that means that naturally occurring, there are 9,000 to the 4th power different recombinants possible. That's due to spontaneous mutation without actually any recombination occurring within your body, which it can occur. It can occur between recombining with other viruses. It can occur between recombining with your tissue. But that is 6.561 times approximately 10 to the 15th or so different viruses. That's a pretty big number. So if you look at it, that means there's a whole lot of different viruses that are possible. And all of them, as a result of the actual nature of this virus, is different. If you have AIDS growing in you, your AIDS virus will be a little bit different than, say, mine, or say John's, or say Alan's. So the virus, as it grows in us, changes. That was one of the first things that led me to conclude that they were either stupid or didn't understand the subject material or lying. And I've never thought that they were stupid. So when you look at this theory, you see the AIDS virus is a field effect. It's a phenomena that some viruses will do some things. Some viruses will produce AIDS. Some viruses may produce lymphomas. Some AIDS viruses may do nothing. So it depends on what part of the field that the virus that you get or grows or decides to grow in you or become in you. It depends on what it does. And it will do something different in everybody. But there's a large chunk of them here that will produce immune destruction and will kill you.
I understand that you're not certain, and in fact you say that this HIV virus does not produce AIDS. Now, Dr. Peter Duesberg, a molecular biologist at Berkeley, says that the AIDS virus does not cause AIDS. He's so convinced of this that he said that he would inject himself with this virus. Do you believe he would be committing suicide in so doing?
No, I don't.
Can you tell me why?
Sure. This gets to the question of how you decide that a germ causes a disease or is influential in bringing about a disease. It's kind of a long story, but to boil it down, the traditional medical way of doing this is you take the germ and you take it from humans that have the disease and you give it to animals. And you watch the animals, and all of the animals are supposed to develop the symptoms of the disease. Or you give it to humans and you watch them develop all the symptoms of the disease. But of course, if the disease is supposed to be fatal, you don't do it on humans unless you can get away with it. So in the case of the HIV virus, they gave the HIV virus to 100 plus chimps in the United States who are now living in sterile isolation tombs in laboratories around the country.
Who's they?
Various researchers that have been doing experiments with chimps trying to bring about AIDS in chimps. I mean, There's a fellow named Eichberg at the Southwest Animal Center who kind of knows all of the information on tracking the chimps. These are people from the National Institutes of Health, CDC, some university researchers. So far, the only thing that's happened to the chimps is that 2 chimps developed infected glands, lasted about 30 weeks, disappeared, and no new symptoms developed. The rest of the chimps have remained healthy with no symptoms. That is, they have the virus in their body, but they haven't developed symptoms. So, as far as that method of proving that HIV causes AIDS or anything, that hasn't been successful. The second method of saying we know that HIV causes AIDS is usually brought up by researchers, and several have told me, including Jay Levy, who's one of the maybe 10 leading researchers in the world on AIDS. We know that HIV causes AIDS because people who are transfused with blood containing HIV develop AIDS and die, and so we know that HIV causes AIDS. And this is often used to explain how a farmer from Iowa who never heard of homosexuality or drugs suddenly was injected a blood transfusion and he died of AIDS. And therefore, the conclusion is, we know that HIV causes AIDS.
How do you explain it?
Well, I called up the American Association of Blood Banks and I said, look, I'd like to find out how many transfusions have been given in the United States since 1978, which is kind of the quote, beginning of AIDS. So they supplied me with some figures, the best they could do. You know, they're the people that track this stuff. And if you add up the figures, it's 30 million blood transfusions. Now, the CDC reports, as of several months ago, that since 1978, 1,466 people have developed what they call transfusion AIDS, that is, AIDS from blood transfusions. That means that 500 thousandths of 1% of the people transfused with blood have developed AIDS. So this is not either proof that a germ causes a disease.
Well, not all blood contains the AIDS virus.
Yes, but if you're dealing with 30 million transfusions, and you have opportunities abounding for blood to be infected by this virus, and only 1,466 people come down with what's supposedly transfusion AIDS, then you are not in a position to say, therefore, we know that HIV causes AIDS. In other words, these researchers are trying to adduce proof and say, we know it because of the blood transfusion route. That doesn't really prove out either. There are some other very...
But it doesn't say it isn't.
It doesn't say that someone couldn't have a disease caused by HIV, but the point I'm making is that these researchers are trying to prove that HIV does cause AIDS. The burden of proof always has been on them. That is one of the very familiar things they do in order to rebut you if you say, I don't see why it causes AIDS, is they say, well, prove it doesn't, essentially. And of course, since you're not equipped with a laboratory and $500 million, you aren't in a position to do that. All you can say is, no, the burden of proof was always on you. What made you think that you knew that HIV caused AIDS in the first place? And then they will unravel these arguments for you. The first is the animal argument, the second is the blood transfusion argument. These are their 2 main arguments. Now, there are many other things you can say about this virus that are kind of strange. For example, if you call up the CDC on the telephone, these are the only people in the country who keep any statistics on AIDS, and you say to them, give me the breakdown on men and women that have AIDS. They will say to you, 91% of the people that have AIDS are men. 9% are either women or children. And if you were to say to them, have you ever heard of a virus that prefers 91% men to 9% women? They will say, well, this is a lot different, we think. They have a lot of talk about it. In addition to that, I would say that there are many other factors being left out of the equation. Robert Gallo, who is the #1 AIDS researcher in the world, the discoverer of the HIV virus, is very fond of saying, and he has been saying for many years, you do not need any other factors. This is the sole agent that will bring about this disease called AIDS. Well, in light of the fact that this has never, he was the one who was supposed to have proved it in the first place, you see. He didn't. But what he does do, and what many AIDS researchers do, is they speculate as to how AIDS might cause, HIV might cause AIDS. I'll give you an example. Peter Duesberg, whom you mentioned, the molecular biologist, says, look, AIDS is supposed to signal a destruction of the T cells. We know that the HIV virus infects about 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 T cells. So at the rate that you replace T cells, how is this going to destroy your T cells? It's like a pinprick. And to this criticism, top NIH researchers, National Institutes of Health researchers like Robert Gallo, and researchers like William Hazeltine at Harvard and Max Essex at Harvard, these are the big time boys, they say, well, we think that there's an autoimmune aspect here. In other words, somehow the virus is inducing the immune system to attack the body. Or we think that in the thymus gland there is some sort of trigger that occurs because the virus sends out a signal and the thymus gland self-destructs. Or we think that the virus really attacks the macrophages first, which is another component of the immune system, and then the macrophages in a key moment kind of pass on the HIV virus to the T cells and they die. And there are many very ingenious explanations as to how a virus which infects 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 cells causes AIDS. But the point is, number one, these are theories. They have not been proven. And maybe even more important, the researchers that propose them at the National Institutes of Health, in almost every case, don't publish very well done, easy to obtain scientific papers in journals that therefore can be verified or rejected or challenged by other scientists. This is the way science is supposed to work. If Robert Gallo decides tomorrow that the HIV virus really attacks this thing called the macrophages in the immune system, according to the rules of the game of science, what he's supposed to do is publish a paper in a journal that proves this. And then scientists from all over the world can reject or accept his conclusions on the basis of his evidence. But in fact, the history of AIDS shows that most of the important discoveries about AIDS have been made in the newspapers, before television cameras, at press conferences where, you know, the researcher emerges from his lab and he says, my God, I've got it. And the Secretary of Health and Human Services is standing there and she says, he's got it. We know the virus now. See, this is a sort of a turnabout in science. We're getting, according to the molecular biologists and people that I talk to who read scientific papers for a living, they tell me that the science of AIDS, as found in published papers and journals, is getting sloppier and sloppier, sloppier and sloppier. And as an example, they cite an instance of a paper which a researcher claims, we have found high volumes of HIV in the human body. Now this has been a serious bone of contention because, as Duesberg claims, they only find very low volumes, incredibly low amounts of HIV in the body. And here's a paper that suddenly appears that says, aha, I found tremendous quantities of HIV in the body. Now this one editor of a science journal said to me, I read the paper, I checked out the methods that this researcher used, and it turned out that the arithmetic was all wrong. That what the researcher said was high volumes is actually almost no volume. And it's a mistake you could have found on your calculator. But half the world of science could turn around tomorrow and say, oh, well, we've solved this problem. Now we know that HIV really infects everybody in high volumes, so Duesberg's arguments are ridiculous. We don't have to worry about them anymore. Instead of considered scientific approach. Here's a paper, let's refute it or challenge it or verify it or whatever we're going to do here. And I think what people have to really understand is the way this AIDS game is being played now in the science journals by the researchers is very political. It's very sloppy. It's very hit and miss. Pronouncements are being made like politicians make pronouncements, not like scientists make pronouncements. And one of the basic reasons this is happening is because, as one researcher put it to me, the money machine is now tied to basic biological research for the first time in the history of medicine. The discoveries that are made or claimed to be made by this research establishment instantly become food for biotech firms to become suddenly overnight. We've got a biotech firm and we're putting all our eggs in this basket. HIV virus, or the HIV virus attacks the macrophages. There's a corporation in Oakland that's about to market a test that will test for macrophages infected by HIV. We're talking money here. And so every new pronouncement, instead of being carefully checked out, refuted or accepted or challenged, suddenly becomes big business. And as been pointed out in an interview in Spin magazine in January of 1988, two researchers, William Hazeltine of Harvard and Max Essex, were accused, I guess that's the right word, of having large amounts of investments in a biotech firm that was marketing HIV tests, antibody tests, you see. So the researcher, Peter Duesberg, who blew this whistle, said, "What does this tell you? If tomorrow one of these scientists suddenly had a brilliant thought that maybe HIV doesn't cause AIDS, but he's got millions invested in a firm that tests for HIV, what is he going to do?" So the reporter called up Hazeltine, according to her article, Cecilia Farber, and she said to him, this is what Duesberg said, "What do you think?" He got very annoyed, but according to Farber, he did admit that he and Max Essex did have shares in a corporation that did market HIV tests. So to me, when you have this kind of situation, the science is very suspect on a lot of levels. I've got more on this, but I think that's good for now.
This what you go into in your AIDS Incorporated?
Yeah, in the book AIDS Inc., there's a number of issues like this taken up. There's 3, 4, 5 chapters on the question, does HIV cause human disease? And I go into this at length.
Robert, what do you have to say about his thesis here?
Well, we disagree with the fact that the putative AIDS virus is not the cause of AIDS. I think that it does cause AIDS. I think there will perhaps be many other viruses that can cause AIDS. Let me just go back to one other point here. Back to the blackboard. Go back to the basic theory of retrovirology. If you look at a virus, which is a retrovirus, this virus comes into the cell. It changes this, the RNA, this is in a form of RNA in the virus. The reverse transcriptase changes that into a DNA form inside your cell, here. Now, that DNA form is then incorporated into the cell so that the virus actually becomes a part of your body. This is the basic theory, in that this information that's now in your genes sends information out to produce new little virus out here that buds off at the cell membrane, and so you get new virus production. Now, in the fact, we think that in the case of AIDS, that there may be a short circuit here, so that the AIDS virus may be able to infect the cell and go directly to new virus production without having to incorporate itself into the DNA. So, in a sense, AIDS could have sort of a direct route, and with AC/DC or direct current, alternating current, it could go in here or it could go here. Visna virus actually can reproduce itself without integrating into the genes. Now, it's always been a theory of retrovirologists that the virus had to integrate, but Visna violates that principle. And based upon the fact that we think AIDS is a recombinant of Visna and VLV, we think that AIDS may violate that principle. And that would explain why, when people say, well, you don't find the virus integrated into the genes in only a very small percentage of cells, our explanation of that is it doesn't have to be, because it doesn't work that way. So, again, we think that that will eventually be shown to be the correct hypothesis. We have maintained all along, from day one, that the central defect in AIDS virus lies in a cell called a macrophage. Again, this is the virus that its job is to process the AIDS virus, divvy it up, and present it to B and T cells, lymphocytes. This is a B lymphocyte, and this is a T lymphocyte. The job of this cell, the macrophage, is to process the virus, chew it up, send it down here to T lymphocytes to make for immunity, cellular immunity, or for antibodies, and B lymphocytes, which make antibodies. We said 3-4 years ago that central defect in AIDS lies in this cell, macrophages, that it has nothing whatsoever to do with lymphocytes, except that macrophages communicate with lymphocytes and inject the virus into them directly. It's only now, in 1988 or so, that so-called AIDS experts are sort of coming to that same conclusion. Now, this has implications for vaccine production, because that will, besides the fact that there are 9,000 to the fourth power different AIDS viruses available, several 6 times 10 to the 15th approximately, which means you have to account for a very large number. If in fact the central defect in AIDS lies in macrophages, and we think that it does, if you make a vaccine, the purpose of a vaccine is to form an antibody directed against this virus. So when these antibodies, if this is an antibody against AIDS, when you get an antibody-AIDS interaction, what that does is help the macrophage, this cell, ingest or enclose or encompass this virus and destroy it. But what happens in the case of AIDS, in our supposition, is that the macrophage ingests the virus antibody combination, and then the macrophage proceeds to chew up the antibodies, and then of course the AIDS virus grows inside of it. And so in our theory, if we're correct about how this actually works, if you get vaccinated against AIDS and subsequently get AIDS, you will die quicker than if you were not vaccinated. Now that's not just theory, because if you look at the great destroyer Visna again, if you take 100 sheep and you vaccinate 50 of them against Visna, and you don't vaccinate 50 of them, and then you give them all Visna, the ones that you vaccinated die quicker than the ones that you didn't. So we have always maintained that there will be 2 reasons that it will be very difficult to get a vaccine produced. The first, you have to account for a very large number of different viruses. The second, the fact that the vaccine may actually make you worse. So that's sort of some of the rebuttal of the Dr. Duesberg's theory, or of what's occurring. If you look at AIDS, they say, well, AIDS represents the greatest scientific achievement ever in mankind. I mean, we know more about this virus than any other agent ever in the history of man. Of course, that is, except they don't know where it came from. They don't know how it does what it does. They don't know how it's transferred between people. They don't know how to prevent it. They don't know how to cure it. And they don't know how to make a vaccine. But everything else, we know all about it. So, you have to question, what do they really know? If you get down to the actual fact of how the virus is transferred between human beings, John mentioned the fact about high volumes. Again, if you look at the way the virus is transferred between humans, they can't tell you to date how the virus goes between humans. Now, we've maintained from day one that this will be the first cellularly transferred disease. In other words, the way this virus gets from one person A to another person B is within a macrophage. That big cell I'm talking about up there, that cell is carrying the virus into the next person. How? Well, okay, how? Directly, like say man to woman transference. The man is infected with AIDS, the woman isn't. Here's how I think the virus actually gets in. If you look at semen, we all know, of course, that there's high titers of AIDS in semen. We all know that, except the fact that's not the fact. There isn't any AIDS virus in semen. If you look at semen, there's no free virus present in the fluid part. There is less than 100 viruses approximately. There are less than 100 AIDS viruses in 100 milliliters of semen. Which means, like you have a year's worth of semen and you've got fewer than 100 viruses present in the whole thing. So you ask yourself, how does the virus, which isn't there, get into the next person? Well, our explanation is that the macrophages in semen, which contain the virus inside of them, like when ejaculate would occur in, say, semen in a woman's vagina, the macrophage looks up there and says, oh gosh, I'm in the wrong place. I need to go home. So he worms his way through the wall of the vagina into the woman's body. Now what happens? The woman recognizes this as a foreign tissue. Her macrophages move in, kill the cell, ingest it all, and now her macrophages have AIDS because they can't kill it. The virus grows inside of her macrophages run around the body and spread it all over. And that is how we really feel that the virus is transferred between people. If you look at the actual numbers of viruses present in semen, there's virtually none there. There is just as much or perhaps more virus present in saliva. They say, well, no, the virus isn't transferred by kissing, that we all know that, but the actual fact is the concentration is the same. This brings up an interesting point here. How many of the studies that have been done that tell us about the transferring of AIDS viruses have controlled for kissing? In other words, how many people that have intercourse, any kind of form you like, oral, anal, vaginal, how many people that are sexually active don't kiss? So, you line up all these people and say, well, they all had obviously intercourse. But to me, it's just as obvious that it could have been kissing until you actually show that only intercourse, sexual intercourse, not kissing, was the actual agent. They say, well, the virus could be transferred by mother's milk, which is, to me, oral, but it's not transferred by kissing. That doesn't make any sense. So there are all these other factors that say the virus is not transferred by kissing. Now, there's another interesting point on this. There was an article written in 1985 or so in Lancet, and the case was a man in San Francisco who had had an abdominal aortic aneurysm repair, which is they took out or replaced part of his aorta, which is the big vessel that runs down the main part of the body. During that operation, he was transfused with AIDS-contaminated blood. Subsequently, his wife becomes HIV positive or AIDS positive on culture. They said it's not present in her secretions except for her blood. They cultured it out. So only this year has now that article been retracted. Of course, the question was, if this man that operation rendered the man impotent, so he couldn't possibly have had an erection because of the operation, how did she get the virus from him unless it was through secretions, particularly saliva? So the fact that the virus was reportedly cultured from her blood was the evidence towards the fact that evidently the virus could be transferred by saliva. Well, interestingly enough, recently in the New York Times, there was an article addressing this very paper, and it said that now they have shown that that's not possible because the original article was incorrect. And they don't know how they happened to manage to make that mistake, but of course it's no longer true. Well, you go back and you ask yourself, well, then if that's not true, then why should we, it's not like you have a test that was negative and now suddenly you have a positive. This was an actual culture when they got the virus out. So your question is, what virus was it that grew out if it wasn't AIDS? Or was there any virus that grew out? And then the most interesting thing is, of course, this was supposedly to have occurred in San Francisco. And I practice medicine in California. And I can tell you that if I had a lady whose husband is dying of AIDS or who has already died of AIDS, and I told her irrefutably because of a culture a couple of years ago that she had AIDS, and I come back a couple of years later and tell her, oh, it was just a joke, there wasn't really any AIDS there, I can assure you that most likely I might get sued. And yet to date, we don't hear anything about that occurring in this case, and so you begin to wonder how valid the whole story is. You raise your questions. I mean, where's the defect? Well, of course, they conclude that by the fact that this lady now is reported as truly negative, they say, well, that proves that it's not transferred by kissing. I say, no, I don't read it that way. It doesn't prove that at all. What it proves is that the original article was, in a sense, a fraud. And so you ask yourself, where did the fraud occur? Did it occur in a mistake in the virus culture? Was there any virus there, or is it all just made up? But to get to the question of transferring during kissing, you have to look at intercourse and kissing and say, is the virus going across during kissing, or is it going across during intercourse? And how do you prove it? How many viruses have to be present in semen for it to get in if that's how it's getting in? Is there a receptor in the vagina that somehow this virus hooks onto and it gets transported into the woman's body? Is it in the cervix? Is it in the cervical cells? Is it in the T lymphocytes of the uterus? Where does it occur? Is this virus absorbable through the GI tract? I mean, you see, there is no data, none, that answers any of these questions. And yet they continually tell us, we know everything there is to know about this virus. Going back to the question of AIDS, if you look at the disease, and again, and this is another problem with these diseases, retroviral diseases, as a rule of thumb, occur over 20% of the lifespan of the species. That was one of the first things I learned when I started reading this literature. And so they said, well, AIDS is going to occur in 3 years or 5 years. I kept thinking, well, this violates the whole fundamental theory. But then they said, no, 5 years, 7 years, no, 7 years, 10 years, 10 years, 14. Pretty soon you get to 14 years, and of course 20% of 70 is about 14. So, the truth comes out eventually. So in a sense, you have to study this disease for a long period of time if you want to make a certain conclusion. So people who are injected or infected today, may not develop disease for a long period of time. This has to do with the actual numbers of people infected. So again, a rule of thumb, you have to remember that in this disease, what you see with AIDS, the disease, is actually probably only 1% or at most 2% of the actual number of cases coming. So the rule of thumb of retrovirology is for every case that you have on the top, you will have at least 50 to 100 coming. So in the case of the United States, which has already to date, let's say 60,000 people with AIDS, if we got 100 coming for that, that gives us 6 million people infected and coming, not the 1 to 1.5 million that they're telling us about. So again, in the disease between the time of infection and the time of disease expression is 7 to 14 years. So if in fact you have 1,100 or 1,600 cases of AIDS due to blood transfusion, as John says the CDC tells us, well, in fact, you could have 160,000 on the road due to the actual true nature of this disease. Now, I'm not saying that many are coming, but I'm saying that's what you would predict based upon the rule of thumb of the nature of these diseases. Now, if you look at the United States with, say, 2 million infected as a conservative figure, you could go, if it doubled every year, you're only about 5 or 6 years away from 128 or 256 million Americans infected. And of course, if it takes 5 or 6 years for anybody to express disease, in a sense, you could have everyone infected before anyone showed symptoms or signs of disease. That is the true problem with the understanding of this disease from a doctor's viewpoint. Doctors look at viruses mostly like as if it was, say, smallpox. It's very stable over time. You get it, you get well, or you kind of die within a short period of time. So we've always said that if you want to know about AIDS, you've got to talk to the veterinarians. It's not by chance that Myron Essex, who's in charge of the human leukemia resource group at Harvard, is not an MD, and he's not a DO, and he's not a chiropractor. He's a doctor of veterinarian medicine. So you say, why do they put a veterinarian in charge of this program? If you look at International Agency for Research on Cancer, International Agency for Research on Cancer just put $8.8 million, mostly United States taxpayer money, into Glasgow. And they put the entire human leukemia resource group under the aegis of the Department of Veterinary Pathology. So you ask yourself, well, geez, it's awfully strange that we have these veterinarians running our AIDS and human leukemia programs. How does that happen? Well, it's quite simple. It's because these diseases came out of animals. That's a simple answer.
Are they saying so?
No, they won't. They don't say that. Of course not. I mean, again, if you say, if you say, well, how come you're the only one saying it? First off, we're not the only ones saying that these diseases have come from animals, but the fact is, if you expect for some guy to come up like any world-renowned AIDS researcher who's getting a few $100,000 in funding, he's not going to come up and say, well, I'm sorry, we made AIDS and we injected it. I mean, that just is not going to happen. The same as Reagan didn't tell you that he sells arms to the Ayatollah. The same as, Eisenhower doesn't tell us we fly U-2 flights over Russia, and many, 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 many other, explanations, examples. So, these researchers, I don't think, are going to admit to that, ever.
Well, maybe by a public outcry, by the circulation of your statements, they will be forced to respond.
Well, I certainly hope so. Right.
Alan, what are pleomorphic bacteria? And would you like to show us your slides?
Yeah, I'd like to show you an aspect of AIDS in particular as reflects upon Kaposi sarcoma, which is the hallmark of AIDS, and as I mentioned in the beginning, was originally termed as gay cancer. And some of you are familiar with Virginia Livingston Wheeler, who was interviewed by Mrs. Prophet, who talked about that. And I basically, for 25 years, have been a student of hers. And so I would like to show you, perhaps to confuse you even more, but rather than confusing, trying to show you that there is a whole aspect of AIDS where you can really relate AIDS to cancer. But if you remember in the beginning, the government scientists very quickly took AIDS away from cancer. And if you had cancer and then you later came down with AIDS, you would not be qualified to be spoken of as AIDS. So that part of the definition was if there was any tinge of cancer, they could never include you in the statistics. So what I'd like to do briefly is just to show you a few of these microbes that have been talked about in cancer, but to my knowledge have never been shown on television ever in the world, particularly as it relates to Kaposi sarcoma. And I show you this for your interest and also to pique your idea that I sincerely believe that some of these viruses may have had their origin in bacteria. Now I know that's heresy because, you know, doctors say we have viruses here and we have bacteria here and we have fungi here and they're all in their neat little boxes and they never go back and forth. But Virginia Livingston constantly talks about the cancer microbe and how it is filterable, and so how it can go from bacterial forms to viral forms. In fact, there is some indication that Dr. Rouse in his chicken experiments basically was dealing with this cancer bacterium that had filterable virus forms. And that work, of course, is the work upon which modern virology is built. So I think it's interesting to at least see these things, and I'll just show you briefly pictures of it, but in your mind, try and see if you can't relate some of this virology and retrovirology to this sort of thing.
Let me just say here, let me interdict here too, that in the case of this virus, their AIDS is somehow directly connected with cancer, if not in production in a laboratory, but certainly has arisen out of the same forces of some sort. If nothing else, you can look and see that all the so-called AIDS, war on cancer people are now conducting the war on AIDS. They're the exact same people. Gallo, Essex, Montagnier, Hazeltine, Levy. If you go back, they were all the same people who were conducting the war on cancer.
And they lost that war.
That's right. They lost that one. We're now in the second one. So, and the other thing is that the question goes back to what is the cause of cancer? It's the fundamental question. Now, I don't pretend to necessarily have the answer, but the question is always centered around whether the organism that Alan's going to show you here, the pleomorphic organisms, progenitor cryptocites named by Virginia, is the cause of cancer, or something else. The NIH and the people, the so-called scientists, have now maintained that cancer was caused by viruses. Well, in the theory of pleomorphism, which means that the organism can have more than one form, since 1911 or 1917, when Zinsser and Rivers really did Kendall and Rife and Rosenau is now absolutely proven. There is no doubt that viruses can have pleomorphic forms, because this virus, the AIDS virus, integrates into the cell. So I ask you, what form is it in when it's integrated and it's not in its virus form? That's 2. So that proves that pleomorphism is real. So if for nothing else, retroviruses have completely destroyed the fact that organisms don't have more than one form. Viruses can have more than one form as the form of when it's integrated into your genes. And so if it's in your genes or in a cow's genes or in a chicken's genes, those are all different forms. So there are many, many forms available.
Well, it's also interesting because we say we know a lot about AIDS, and we know that the so-called Kaposi sarcoma is the hallmark of AIDS, and yet we know nothing more about that than we did 100 years ago. And even though HIV or AIDS virus or HTLV3, these are all synonymous terms, even though that supposedly causes AIDS, it does not cause Kaposi sarcoma. In fact, they're scratching their head saying, what does cause this? And of course, what I'd like to try, what I've tried to convince them to do is to look under the microscope, but that is extremely difficult to do because physicians are convinced there's nothing to see, but I'm going to show you something.